Cuba always celebrates the arrival of a new year and one more year, a revolutionary year. It is 60 years since this uninterrupted struggle, when the shadow became light and the beast was defeated by the welfare of men. And yesterday, Raúl Castro Ruz emphasized this. The revolution is still young, and this is not rhetoric. It's a historic confirmation because since the first moments, protagonist was youth, and this has been the same in the first 60 years. They still have many young people struggling. They are always updating without making any resignation of the nature of resolution and without taking the Communist Party away from the guiding, the steering role. Cuba, geopolitical role of the island 60 years after revolution, is our critical move today. On Tuesday, January 1st, 2019, Cuba celebrated its 60-year anniversary of its revolutionary success. As traditional, it took place in the Santifiqueño Cemetery, very close to where very famous heroes are, like José Martí, Fidel Castro Ruz, for example. The main speech was given by Raúl Castro Ruz, first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba. This hero made a historic review and remembered how 60 years ago they entered Santiago for the first time and the people reached political power. When we celebrate 6 decades of our success, when under the command of Fidel, for the first time, the Cuban people reached political power and were able to enter Santiago de Cuba. 60 years later, after the absolute domain against the U.S. imperialism on Cuba. Once again, Cuba is being accused when we have proved that the external debt, migration flows, a pillage of natural resources are the result of the domination of transnational in our continent. The force of truth has destroyed the lies and the history by placing facts and protagonists in their own place. The Cuban Revolution and the written history of this heroic people is only responsible for their example as a symbol of full independence, resistance, victory, justice, social justice, altruism, and internationalism. Several messages were given yesterday through social networks congratulating this celebration. Let's start with a message of Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez through Twitter. Honor and glory for those who in January 1959 ended the long night of the Batista dictatorship and earned for Cuba the title of the Island of Freedom. Then we have the message published by the head of state of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro. We celebrate the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution conducted by Commander Fidel Castro. 60 years of sacrifice, struggles, and blockade. There is the heroic Cuban people, an example of resistance and dignity in the world. And closed his message by saying, "Long live Cuba." The president of plurinational state of Bolivia, Evo Morales, also sent a message through Twitter. Just like today in 1959, with the success of the Cuban Revolution, the light of hope and invincible will for the liberation of peoples were born. We salute the victory of our brother Commander Fidel Castro and the brave Cuban people over the pro-imperialist dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Now, we will see the map of Cuba. Potentiality of Cuba, archipelago of the Antilles and the Caribbean, one of 13 states independent of the mainland continent of the America, and the biggest island, the Greater. It is known as key to the Gulf for its geographic position. It's the largest island, and it's near Haiti, Bahamas, Jamaica, Mexico, east of Yucatan Peninsula, and the United States. To the north, it has Florida and Bahamas. To the west, Mexico, south Cayman Islands and Jamaica, east Haiti, and southeast Hispaniola. Without Guantanamo was legally occupied by the United States with a military base. It has around 110,000 square kilometers. It's organized in 15 provinces and one special municipality, with Havana as capital, the largest city and main port. The archipelago is called the Island of Youth, of more than 1,000 keys or small islands. Its highest point is Pico Tiquina, a functioning independent socialist republic with a little over 11 million inhabitants. Its top legislative organ is the National Assembly of Popular Power. On April 19, 2018, Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez became the head of state and the successor of Fidel Castro Ruz. Since now, the island is being upgraded with a new constitution, which collects the proposal of a society and was passed on December 22nd. And on February 22, it will be submitted to a popular referendum. In spite of a U.S. campaign and blockade for more than 50 years, because its interference policy is opposed with revolution, the organized people eradicated illiteracy and granted the country leadership in education and health, with a vocation of international solidarity that has enabled to help thousands of countries around the world. A mistake, since what we just listened. On February 24th is the date chosen to pass the draft constitution that was approved by the current National Assembly of Popular Power. And on December 22nd, it was passed. We're going to Agencia Latina under the title "Cuba Willing to Have a Peaceful and Respectful Relation with the United States," which was also part of the words pronounced by General Raúl Castro Ruz, the main speech given by the Vice President of the Communist Party of Cuba, which was historic and was a review of history. The words that General Castro pronounced in this regard were the following: "I reiterate our willingness to cohabit in civilization in spite of differences in a relation of peace and mutual benefit with the United States. We've also said that us Cubans are prepared to resist a confrontation, which we don't want, and we hope that the most balanced minds in the U.S. administration avoid it. Versus the Monroe Doctrine, will have to defend the principles of Latin America and Caribbean proclaim as a zone of peace signed in Havana by the heads of state that now some allies of the United States pretend to ignore. This is a quote of the speech given yesterday by General Raúl Castro. And now we'll go to our recommendation published in televisurtv.net under the title Cuba, Real Democracy, written by Ángel Guerra, international analyst, writer of La Jornada. And the abstract we have chosen to invite you to seek this article and read it in full is Cuba celebrates the 60th anniversary of revolution when it has concluded a participative process that unprecedented in the world, where 9 million of Cubans participated from August 13 to November. And the text of the Constitution resulted in the inclusion of more than 50% of the proposals made by that instance. It generated around 760 changes, around 60% of articles. When we're talking about current Cuba, we must say this. And the author also talks about, and in the words of President Miguel Díaz-Canel, the new constitution reaffirms the socialist root of the constitution and allows us, all the administration and the people, to perfect, strengthen institutionality, establishes the prevalence of the Constitution in social justice and equality. The author reflects on this process of modernization that Cuba is undergoing. Let's remember what happened yesterday in Havana with Aline Fernandez, our correspondent. Happy New Year, Aline.
Hola, un gusto saludarte. Efectivamente, los cubanos han
celebrado Cubans celebrated the success of Cuban Revolution, the 60th anniversary, and they did it dancing throughout the night in each community of the country. And of course, the words of the first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba, Raúl Castro Ruz, were very important yesterday in the celebration that took place in the cemetery of Santa Ifigenia in Santiago de Cuba, known as the cradle of the revolution, where the leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro, was buried, as well as other independentists like Carlos Manuel de Céspedes and Mariana Rajales. He was clear, the Cuban leader, when he talked about the country's will to continue establishing a dialogue with the United States and normalize relations, but always in a dialogue between equals, without any shadow to Cuban independence. He said on the table the problems Cuba has had for the blockade of the United States, especially what happened in the last years. The Cuban leader was also clear when he expressed his support and full will to and agreement with Díaz-Canel's administration, where the revolution is being turned to new generations of Cubans. And this clarifies any question or doubt that the world may have about the rupture between Díaz-Canel, Raúl Castro, and the so-called historic generation. It's a process, a continuous process as Díaz-Canel, and no rupture. It's a continuity process. Thank you for your information. 60 years after the success of the Cuban Revolution, it is about to update new and traditional. So what are the challenges Cuba has now? How the demands are synchronized with time without losing their heroic tradition? We will leave this question to analyze with our analyst after this pause.
Acompañamos a los pueblos que resisten en cada una de sus luchas.
Somos esa ventana que se abre para visibilizarlos entre fronteras.
Thursdays, only on Telesur.
We'll continue talking about our critical move on Cuba because of its 60th anniversary of the revolution. On the news we are sharing with you, we have the question, how current is the revolution? This media consulted different Cuban politicians to analyze the principles and premises of the revolution, and it represents the main resistance of Latin America against the United States. We have several quotes. For example, the Cuban Revolution was one of the most important events of universal history in Latin America and the Caribbean. Opened what I call a long cycle against colonialism and imperialism. Many of the further events could not be explained without the success of the revolution. This was Luis Armando Salazar, professor of the University of Havana. There's another quote of this same author. In spite of the amendments the United States has made in relation to Latin America and the Caribbean, it has continued with its policy against the revolution, the Cuban Revolution. It is always showing its attempt to destroy the revolution unsuccessfully, resulting of the incapacity of the bourgeois party of that time. A new movement of an indefatigable effort started and was conducted by Fidel Castro Ruz, a lawyer whose first activities were developed in the university, and started a new armed strategy against Batista's dictatorship. And Fidel started preparing the final battle that materialized a dream of freedom, even though what came after that victory was very much more complex. As he said on January 8, 1959, at his arrival to Havana. The actions unchained on July 26, 1953, with simultaneous attacks to Cuartel Moncada in Santiago de Cuba and Bayamo, conceived as a popular struggle. Tens of soldiers were murdered, others survived, including Fidel Castro, were judged and condemned to severe prison. The judge, in the trial, he made a famous speech where he said that history will absolve us. He explained the causes, ways, and goals of the struggle, and that became the program of the revolution. 1955, Fidel and his peers, subject to amnesty, founded the 26th of July movement. After showing all impossible legal struggle, Fidel Castro left to Mexico in order to carry out a liberating expedition, while bourgeois parties started a new conciliating maneuver with Batista, and the failure ended by in 1956, Fidel Castro landed from Guam. 2 days before, clandestine soldiers of Movement 26 July had supported the disembarkment in Santiago de Cuba. After the failure of this, that dispersed the expeditionary contingent, Fidel Castro and a group of soldiers won the Sierra Maestra. 1 month later, they took La Plata and showed that the dictator was wrong in saying that they exterminated the expeditionaries. In 1958, they made a general strike in Sierra Maestra. Fidel Castro created 2 columns in the command of Raúl Castro and Juan Almeida, who opened 2 guerrilla fronts in other parts of the mountains. On January 1st, 1959, and with all the support of the people, Batista left the country, and Eulogio Cantillas started to tried to create a civic military board. And Fidel Castro called for a general strike that will assure the success of the revolution, that allowed the defeat and dismantlement of a new neo-colonial political system. 4 months later, in La Plata, the first law was issued, an agrarian reform to end with land ownership. This is how the full exercise of essential rights was guaranteed. This is why they say end to tyranny. We're going to add Iroel Sanchez, the editor of Insomne. We connect with us from Havana. A revolution that has never stopped, as Raúl Castro said yesterday, subjected to all kinds of threats, pain, aggressions, lies, sabotage, blockade, and it's celebrating 6 decades without interruption. How has this been possible? Yes, Lucia, greetings to you. Congratulations or Happy New Year. And for the 60th anniversary of the revolution, we know you celebrate. Revolution has not stopped because it is alive. It has been able to renew versus aggressions of all kinds, and it continues to be something that the United States, in its Dominion strategy, has not been able to destroy. It continues to see it as a challenge near its border, as an alternative to the model it proposes for Latin America and the world, which is unconditional subordination. In this hemisphere, United States in 200 years has never treated anyone as an equal, and Cuba, as President Raúl Castro reiterated, this has been assumed by successive generations of the Cuban people in a successful way. The first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba, Raúl Castro, one of the founders of the revolution, who had the last phase in the generation led by Fidel, led a successful transformation and to a generational transformation that is now led by Miguel Díaz-Canel, who has a very high consensus among the Cuban people in spite of the campaigns. This has also become a constitutional debate, and he has more than 9 million people participated in Cuba. More than 60% of the Constitution has been renewed with proposals from the citizens, and the Cuban Revolution starts optimistically with hope, a challenge in the economic field, but renewal capacity that has been successfully proved for 60 years. What are those challenges in the economic field? Raúl Castro yesterday said that these are difficult times not only for Cuba, this is a global systemic problem. Well, in the first place, there is an international economic crisis. We must see how Latin America closed this year with very small growth, just above 1%, just like Cuba did, and this is also projected for this year. There's once again the blockade and economic international persecution that seeks to close all income to Cuba, and this has led to the strategy with the Brazilian government to expel Cuban physicians. That also was something important for the Brazilian people and Cuban income. Also, Venezuelan destabilization seeking to create damage to Cuba. Besides this, Cuba needs to increase its exports and potentiate all efficiency reserves, eliminate bureaucracy in state companies, which is the essential part of Cuban economy, attract foreign investment, something that has been proposed as an essential non-complementary strategy of the economy, and that new threats of the United States seek to impede with its blockade, and also seek to integrate the private sector that now sums up to 600,000 Cubans in different areas of society, and integrate them in a more harmonic way to the national economy. This was discussed repeatedly in the last session of the Cuban National Assembly, and also by Raúl Castro. Now, do you think the historic continental framework is complex? Because I think there's a dichotomy. Governments that are allied, solidary, that believe in multilateralism, like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, are still there. But the right wing is also advancing and has retaken spaces that the left took over, for example, Brazil. So is the historic framework we have right now complex? More than complex, I will call it unfavorable for Cuba and also the countries you mentioned, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. It's a strategy that did not start with Trump. It started with Obama in 2009 with a coup against Manuel Zelaya, Honduran president, and continued with these coups in Paraguay and Brazil, and also continues creating conditions so the popular forces never come back to power with all the judicial processes we see around Latin America. For example, Brazil against Lula, Argentina against Cristina Fernandez, Ecuador against Vice President Glass, and the threat against President Correa. This is a systemic strategy of the United States that doesn't have to do with the government in power, and of course also seeks, and above all to isolate Cuba and go back to times where Cuba was alone in the Western Hemisphere. That will not happen. We will not go back to the situation where Latin America was before the Bolivarian process and the arrival of Commander Chavez in Venezuela. Nevertheless, there is a step back, a significant step back that causes an unfavorable situation for Cuba in the political and economic arena that the United States seeks to press the Cuban Revolution. But the Cuban Revolution has proved historic capacity of survival. Yesterday, General Castro said they should not believe they will be successful with Cuba because it has been successfully confronted for 60 years. He remembered that 12 administrations in one way or another failed in that. But alternatives must be thought. Cuba has a continental consensus, and we could say inside governments that are not ideological akin to Cuba, there is a consensus that U.S. blockade is a failure. Perhaps the new government of Bolsonaro is an exception, but this has been repeated by several governments in the region, all kinds of ideologies. And today, Cuba has an authority with almost all the countries of the continent, with the last exception I was mentioning, and has a diplomatic capacity when the United States blocked the UN decision once again. So that is nothing new, this new strategy that you call complex, and that Cuba is able to survive successfellly. We would also have to see is how we potentiate, and this was mentioned both by Díaz-Canel and Raúl, all our economic forces to answer to the Cuban people's needs, take advantage of everything that the revolution has created in these years, intelligence, professional capacity, and integrated to Cuban development. Cuba today is in conditions to do it. Cuba has made deep transformation in the last years that place it in the best conditions for that. And if it confronted the United States before, it will do it again. We've talked about the live revolution, and everything that you say is quite unfavorable for the Cuban revolution, but also the modernization process that Cuba has undergone to approve a new constitution with novel principles without losing its socialist nature. I would like an answer to something that Raúl Castro mentioned. The revolutionary process is not limited to the people who started it, but to the will and commitment of youth who assure its continuity. The new generations are obliged to guarantee that the Cuban Revolution is both revolution of youth, socialist, for and by the poor. Well, I think there are two essential elements are there. One, the capacity of renewal and live in new Cuban generations. Cuba has shown the capacity of creating new symbols, the successful return of Elian Gonzalez, the successful return of the 5 heroes who were in U.S. jails, and also the renewal of the capacity to project the new generations to the future that, according to the revolution, the fact that the United States must reiterate its aggressions and that media campaigns continue is a clear signal that the revolution is still alive. Otherwise, the United States would not need to do that. They tried to discredit the Cuban Revolution because it is alive, and if it is revived in the youth, as General Castro said, their commitment with the poor, it will remain alive, and unfortunately we will have to cohabit with the imperialism. As Raúl remembered, Fidel said, while empires day, the Cuban Revolution will have to give more attention to the defense with being strong enough for the cost of that aggression, make the aggressor think that he can't do it. The empire has shown too many times that it only respects those who are respectable, and the Cuban Revolution has proved it. Thank you very much for your vision to our public. Happy New Year and happy 60th anniversary. This was Iroel Sanchez. And yesterday we heard Raúl Castro in such important speech. The revolution is similar to a prairie in a drought. A sparkle could damage the interests of all. So it has the specificity of being a pioneer and creating a socialist revolution in the West. What does this represent, Cuba represent in our continent, in our region, and beyond? We will answer this after this second pause.
The life is full of moments. Moments of fight. Moments of hope. Moments that transcend. Moments that you can live in. Telesur documentaries. Sundays. Only on Telesur.
Cuba, geopolitical role of the island 60 years after the revolution. In this final part, we would like to review how it has woven international alliances based on multilateralism and the need of unit with the most diverse in the world. Unit and diversity are two key words. In the last years, the role of international organizations has been essential for the progress of this multilateralism and Latin American, Caribbean, and African unit. So it also has to say the island in terms of world geopolitics. Cuba is a founding member of the United Nations and member of most of its agencies like FAO, UNESCO, and NUT. It has signed several multilateral treaties on environmental protection, drug traffic, and is member of several instances like the World Trade Organization, Customs Organization, and others. While in the region, it is part of regional organizations like Caribbean Community, Bolivarian Alternative for America, CARICOM, ECLAC, Latin American Integration Association, also a member of non-aligned groups, Group of 77, Group of Africa, Caribbean. The revolution's political strategy has materialized in simultaneous responses, several moves at a time with anticipated moves. Thus, their relations with Russia, China, Venezuela, and European countries. In the post-Obama war, with the policy of blockade to the islands and the void of Trump's policy, it is occupied with new relations with post-Soviet Russia, which is a new partner in Havana with more than $224 million. Putin has agreements in technical and military aspects and energy cooperation, transportation, aviation, space, and health. There is no Latin America geopolicy without the Cuban reference that broke the tradition of imperialism. Closing the door to Pan-Americanism, a new configuration, the relations between two political blocs. In its relation with the Caribbean countries, it is concerned for nature and the economic and political relations of the region. We'd like to incorporate Ernesto Wong, University Professor. Happy New Year. Happy New Year to all. Let's start for the geopolitical role of Cuba in these times. In terms of geopolitics, I think we must think on what Cuba meant for the peoples or governments who sought to lead their society to a brighter independence from that colonial era our world lived since the end of the 15th century, 16th century. And these were times of colonial oppression. So with this revolution that started in 59, that succeeded in 59, and took off as the first signal was Cuba's incorporation to the non-aligned movement, to the Afro-Asian movement. Let's remember with Bandung in 1955, and that when Cuba succeeded in 1959, the main leaders, Nero, Nasser, Nkrumah, Tito, Sukarno, saw the possibility of expanding the Afro-Asian movement with Latin America. And that is the first meaning that Cuba has for the struggles that incorporate Latin America. And the non-aligned movement was created in 1961. There's an integration with countries that promote with socialist terms that gave them a first support that against the blockade that the United States started. And at the same time, the relation with the revolutionary movements, the Tri-Continental 65, 66, was an example and a stimulus for revolutionary movement, for the struggle of dictatorial, oppressive, criminal governments in the three continents, Asia, Africa, Latin America. This was the first great international configuration, given the isolation that the United States attempted with Latin America. This was quite unfavorable movement, times that they pretend to renew. The United States pretends to renew that, but it can't because the people have learned a lot. They have learned to criticize even the governments that fail to comply with what they have to do and have great impact in what has happened. But in spite of the moment being unfavorable to Latin America and some parts of Europe also, where conservative and fascist forces have scaled up, international forces enable continue advancing and avoid an armed aggression, because even if they couldn't do it when Cuba started its revolution, now that Cuba has a military experience that was proved with an African power that had the atomic bomb and succeeded. So with everything that Cuba has renewed with youth that started from the beginning, because that was a policy of Fidel Castro, incorporate youth. The people who are 50, 55 years old are there because it was an initial policy of Fidel. The thing is that sometimes we only see the main figures who broke with a former practice. But Cuba has always incorporated youth in the government structures, and the revolution was always concerned for incorporating youth to guarantee the future. And this is what they're doing, continuing with this constitution that is the result of the incorporation of these youngsters who now have 40, 50, or 60 years old, who are convinced on how things must change. And if the state has an important power, which is the people, because democracy is officially exercised in Cuba since the first constitution. Is it a pioneer, this popular power? Yes, the first national referendum was subjected to the Constitution was suggested to a referendum in 1966, first in the province of Matanza, 1 year before applying these ideas, where they saw some details they had to change. And on February 24, 1966, the first socialist constitution was approved in Cuba. Now, on February 24th, we are awaiting the second constitution's approval with all the changes that have been mentioned from the state's point of view, with a president, vice president, first minister, something new. But this power is distributed, and also the National Assembly that has a main role, because after the members of the National Assembly are elected by the people, the Assembly decides who the President of the Republic is. This is a system that exists in several countries of the world, mainly parliamentary system, because of the role of assembly and it's the maximum power. When we prepare for this program, we discussed if the continental geopolitics were understandable without looking at the Cuban Revolution, because it undoubtedly comes out with Pan-Americanism that creates the theory of two Americas, because it turned the cultural relations against the hegemony of the North.
Y pueblos que son contrarios a esa hegemonía, ¿no?
Sí, sí. Mira, hay un reciente libro que
There's a recent book published by the Bolivarian University of Venezuela about unit, identity, integration, independence. When there's identity, which I think is an important element in Latin America today, and the possibility of unified struggle exists, there could be many perspectives to change these governments that demagogically have reached power, because all these right-wing governments have reached power with a speech trying to replace left-wing speeches. This is something we must consider, because with people who are unprotected because of capitalism, these speeches have their effect, but when years go by, they see that they are unable to comply with their promises because they defend the interests of oligarchy. So this process is taking place in Latin America at present, and the governments who were consequent or consistent with transformation ideas are still there, confronting threats, coups, but they are still there because there's also an international configuration that is different. There's the power of Russia and China, and the countries members of Shanghai Cooperation that are very important. They have the economic capacity of transcending their borders. India is announcing to follow China's road to Latin America, Pakistan as well, besides Russia, that has progressed in the last years and also starts to be support from the military point of view. In Cuba and Venezuela and other Latin American countries, there are military exchanges, and this makes them more balanced and allows revolutionary processes to continue their road. Like in Venezuela, we are looking at transformations that take time, because we cannot think that structures can be changed overnight. In order to arrive to a productive economy needs awareness, the new productive culture. All this takes time, but I think things are going very well. In all these years in social networks, we see that the success of the 1959 revolution is completely effective now and stimulates Venezuela and the different forces of the world. This is why the U.S. oligarchy is so concerned in trying to stop the process in Venezuela, because interesting perspectives of change are taking place even in the United States. This is, it seems it does not conceive its geopolicy without Cuba. Yes, and it's their interest to try to make people afraid, not following Cuba or Venezuela. And in this dialect with reaction, counter-revolution, revolution, this new world is living. Thank you very much, Professor, for your time. Let's go to our conclusions.
Ciertamente se renuevan tiempos desfavorables para Cuba.
Times are unfavorable for Cuba and allied countries because the imperial circle is getting closer. Nevertheless, in the case of Cuba, there is no sign of changing its originary socialist nature. On the contrary, this revolution is completely alive and ratifies its socialist nature with the discussion of a new constitution. Important challenges, the economic field, the confrontation of the blockade, unity, the interests of the poor, safeguard independence and sovereignty, a new generation and youth with historic leadership and origins, as those we have remembered today. They say that some contradictions should be found because in the last years we have seen generational change with a clear continuity, with the support of all the people that will always have the final word, and of course the continuity of the model against continental neoliberalism based on justice, humanity, and this is at the end of our critical mood. Thank you for being with us.
Sigan en sintonía de Telesur. Gracias por su confianza.